Good morning and welcome to Fin24 Speaks. This is the first in what we hope will be an engaging series of interviews on everything about the global economy, the world of business, and South Africa's place in it, of course. My name is Ron Derby, editor of Fin24, I think for almost 2 months now. Thank you so much for joining us. And our first guest is Michael Power, global strategist at 1991, formerly Investec. I've been following Michael's views for years on the globe and South Africa's place in it. I mean, his views on the future of the established economic powers, but with a particular focus on the rise of the East and China. Now, we've just published Michael's latest piece, Can the East Challenge the West's Dominance of the Global and Economic Narrative, on Fin24. I suggest you take a read today or over the weekend and give yourself some time as well. It's a deep dive, which I hope to do just some justice to it over the course of this interview. Good morning, Michael, and thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning, Ron, and thanks for having me.
Mike, let's get into this thing. The first question I want to ask is, when free market capitalism and liberal democracy, does it still have a future over the next decade or so as it shapes the globe? And what weaknesses does the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis expose in both these philosophies?
Well, I think that they were separate beings, but convenient bedfellows for about 100 years. And the question is, are they going to continue to be convenient bedfellows in the sense that they will be complementary to each other? And I'm beginning to think that they won't be, and that capitalism has a greater opportunity to mutate and stay with us, admittedly in a new form, but the liberal democracy as we know it may be running out of road. One of the most important essays that was recently written was done by Yuval Noah Harari in the Financial Times about 4 weeks ago. And I paraphrase his most important paragraph, but in it he says, "Pandemics fast forward history." And what I think is happening now is that the weaknesses that are beginning to show in liberal democracy are being massively highlighted by the pandemic. Whether that's in the United States or Europe, I think we are beginning to see that the system is very, very sensitive to crisis. And governments need to move very fast and very heavily to try and, as it were, come to the rescue, firemen to the rescue. The trouble is, as you probably know, is using the fireman analogy, sometimes you end up with massive water damage that does almost as much damage as the fire did. And I think that's the danger at the moment, that the sensitivity I talked about is bringing forth huge amounts of essentially government-created money. There was a time when Ben Bernanke, the former head of the Federal Reserve, was known as Helicopter Ben because he said, in times of crisis, I will get up in a helicopter, I'll fly above you and throw money out of the window, and that's how we'll get through. Well, not so this time. It's B-52 bombers that are throwing money out of the window. The amount of money that's been created is off the charts, beyond anything that Ben Bernanke could ever have imagined. I mean, we're probably going to see a budget deficit in the United States this year of $4 or $5 trillion. The original forecast at the beginning of this year was about 1.2. So we've gone up 4 times in the space of 4 months. And I think that won't end there. And of course, the US is not the only one that's doing this. We have it in Europe, we have it in Japan, we have it in Australia, New Zealand, we have it in South Africa on our own scale. And we have some very new developments, which you have to be a bit of a policy wonk to understand the significance. But in the past, by and large, when this money was created, it was at least routed through the bond market. Today, we have the Bank of England printing money, not even selling it through the bond market and giving it to the government. This is a massive new change, and that's all in order to try and preserve what we call liberal democracy. Now, liberal democracy is coming under all sorts of threats, not just from debt, but I would argue perhaps one of the most important is demographics. Society is aging. There are huge numbers of old people, many of them now drawing pensions that they haven't funded. They've thought the government would fund. So you have a situation like in Italy, for instance, at the moment, where the unfunded pension liabilities of those who are yet to retire is about 200% of GDP.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some problems looming, given the way liberal democracies have been structured. And again, the pandemic is fast-forwarding history and revealing those problems.
And also pose a question, I guess central bankers in behaving the way they do, reacting the way they do, they learned the lessons from the 1929, the stock market crash and the subsequent Great Depression from there. Does this also pose a question about, are central bankers really independent, or are they almost falling in line with what their governments of the day are saying? I mean, locally, our Reserve Bank has fundamentally tried to keep its independence, but the more I think of it, the US Federal Reserve, ECB, and the Bank of England, they're kind of almost in following the political agenda.
Spot on, absolutely right. In fact, there's very little technical difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy any longer. And if you saw the head of the Federal Reserve in the United States and Steve Mnuchin, the head of the Treasury, speaking to the Senate last week, it was as if two different members of the same committee were actually addressing the Senate. The Fed says we've done pretty much all we can. We've still got a few ideas that we could throw at you, but really it's over to you, Steve. You've got to start printing that money, and we'll basically, obviously, distribute it for you. You're absolutely right. The independence of central banks has gone by the by. That's one of the big casualties of the last few months. To be honest, if you look a little deeper, it was going by the by even before this started. But again, pandemic's fast forward history. It's happened now.
Now, after the end of the First World War and the Great Depression that we spoke about now, that would follow for 10 years after that, would see like the old continent of Europe emerge much weaker from the First World War and usher in, as were the American century. Do you think this global recession, the one we're currently in, a similar position perhaps in world history where the West's dominance of both our political and economic narratives closes in on its end as well?
I think that's absolutely right. I don't think the Americans have realized that yet. I think the Europeans are sort of realizing it and trying to find a sort of a post-Western dominated role for them to play in the world. And it's going to be very difficult because of the reasons we've talked about. The Americans don't realize quite how fast things are changing. Donald Trump likes to use the phrase, make America great again. Well, this will be the decade of make China great again.
Yeah.
And we have to understand that China has been the largest economy on earth for 25 of the last 27 centuries. The last two have just been an aberration. The Chinese have a phrase for it. They've been the centuries of forgetfulness. But the reality is that the status quo ante is now in the process of being restored. And there's a certain sort of almost numerical logic in that, simply because Asia is where the world's population is most concentrated. Yes, there's going to be something of an arm wrestle, a little one-sided at the moment between China and India. But nevertheless, China versus the United States, we're talking about 3.5 times the population, one versus the other. And it's only a matter of time before China, I think it is, getting its act together so that, in a sense, its own manifest destiny, which has always been as the world's largest population country, to be at the top of the pile, is restored.
But the emergence of these populist leaders in the West, such as Donald Trump, US President Donald Trump, Boris Johnson in the UK, who came on the back of that national, the Brexit ticket, is their rise also in response to this increasing uncertainty at the center, I guess, of Western society? I mean, rising inequality is a problem here, but in the West, it's exploding as well.
I'm not surprised that it happened. I can't see a direct A, B, C, D, E, F, G line that you can draw between one and the other. But to some extent, it's not surprising that when parts of society feel that they are losing, they react in the way that they do, and they support populist leaders. One of the most powerful instincts in humanity is something called loss aversion. We react much more to save what we already have than to try and get what we don't yet have. And what we are seeing is that because middle classes in the West have, broadly speaking, not seen their incomes grow for the last 20 years. In fact, Italy as a country has not seen its economy grow for the last 20 years. It's not surprising that leaders step forward and say, I have the solution. I know what the problem is. And they come up with not necessarily complete sets of lies. In fact, their attraction is that there is a sort of almost shallow logic to what it is that they're saying. But the reality is that not only is it much more difficult than that, but it may actually simply be rather like you and I getting older, impossible to stop. And it's just the way in which history ages. And what we're seeing at the moment is the West has had its time in the sun. And that is now, as I say to lots of my friends, it's only in accordance with nature. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And that the sun is now setting in the west again. And I think that both the politics and the economics are combining at the moment to make that happen.
The death of these Western democracies, how much is it setting back its young population there? I mean, in response to the corona pandemic, it was both dollars are being printed as well as euros, and debts are rising once again. This political short-termism, is there an end to it, especially when you have these every 4 years, 5 years, it's these political cycles, the elective cycles. This is going to continue until what point do real questions be asked about this economic trajectory?
Well, I think that, I mean, it's repeating something you said before, but in a slightly different way. The tolerance for pain in Western democracies is extraordinarily low at the moment. And people will, and the phrase that came out of Mario Draghi's mouth, do whatever it takes, it might sound like a very clever phrase, and at the time it was, but the reality is that it's quite a dangerous phrase, because eventually you will have to pay in one way or another for what it is that you have done. What goes around comes around. And people ask me, so, what is the future of Italy? And I usually answer by saying, have you ever been to Argentina? Now, interestingly, Argentina's #1 source of immigrants over this period of time was from Italy. There are more Italians in Italy, in Argentina than any other group. And the future of the likes of Italy could be profoundly Argentine. And if you see the problems that Argentina is going through at the moment as a result of basically living beyond its capabilities for an extended period of time, some people might argue almost 100 years, the currency is falling. They are defaulting almost certainly this week on their debt. And they have populist leaders threatening to do all manner of magic things in order to restore their former glory. Personally, I regard Buenos Aires as one of the most beautiful cities on the planet. And I, at a very personal level, love the Argentine people. But they have problems. And I think those problems are a vision of the sorts of future that particularly Europe, I think the United States, partly because of its, dare I say it, a racial mix, faces a more complicated and it'll take a little bit more time, difficult future. But I do think that much of Europe, particularly the southern part of Europe, is heading in the direction of Argentina, sad as it is to say.
You're a bit of an economic historian. With regards to Argentina, what do you think really went wrong in that country? I mean, that country has been shaped largely by populist leaders, the Perons and so on. What went wrong with the Argentinian story? Which even I know as a man, it's always been a story around Argentina's economy and consistent defaults.
At the risk of gross simplification, they never grew out of the age of growing meat for the rest of the world. They did not stay with the times. And you and I have been talking about economic relevance before. They did not remain economically relevant as time progressed. And the product that they sold had occasional periods where it was in high demand and prices were good. But as a general rule, over time, it fell back in the hierarchy of value addedness on the global economy, so that Argentina ended up having aspirations that were greater than its economic capabilities could pay for. And so it kept on feeling as if it used to be, or it was what it used to be, and spending like it was still like that. But the reality is that it wasn't able to back it up with products, new spaces in the economic game that had economic relevancy and value that was in keeping with today's times.
So almost that relevance we're talking about is something that I guess South Africa needs to learn a lesson from. That was, I guess South Africa we hold on to, I guess, our commodities, our mining space, and the relevance that we still have there, and we hold tightly and almost build an economy on the back of that. That's something we should learn from not repeating those mistakes.
I completely agree, Ron. I'm not going to give you my full answer because I know you and I are going to have another conversation on this subject at a future time, but you're absolutely right. And that's a good place to start when we have that conversation.
Now, going back to the rise of the East and decline of the West, I'll stick a bit on the West. I mean, when Trump dreams of Make America Great Again, as you spoke about now, I imagine, to me, he's talking about the 50s in America, post-World War II, the baby boom generation. It looks to me much like that it's almost China and emerging Asia that is having that moment, right? Building all the wares, all the stuff the world wants, and the huge industrial base there. Is that the shift? Is China having that moment?
Absolutely right. And interestingly, following on from Argentina, when you hear about what it is that Trump wants to sell China, it's soybeans and natural gas, right?
Yeah.
In fact, if you look at America through the eyes of China as to what it is that China imports from the United States, so how is America relevant to China? Of the top 10 items physically imported, 9 of them are in the natural resource space.
Yeah.
The 10th was Boeing, and we all know what's happened there. That's gone by the by.
Yeah.
In other words, through the eyes of China, and there are still some technical transfers which somewhat compromise what the generalization I'm about to make, but through the eyes of China, the United States is becoming a glorified Canada or Australia. It's a natural resource exporter.
Yeah. It changes the game, right? It
massively changes the game. Hence my my Argentine example.
Now, in speaking about that heyday, the 50s, going to the US, the taxation rates were very high at that point, right? I mean, but today, the US cuts taxes in the hope of boosting the economy, but it kind of seems counterproductive to me, and in fact, feeds the whole inequality question within that country, and it's lack of competitiveness.
Couldn't agree more. And people who say that low taxes immediately provoke higher growth just don't know the history. That is not the case. I think what one needs to have is a tolerable level. I think I'm almost quoting Adam Smith there. A tolerable level of taxation. That's not to say that one needs to have high taxes necessarily, but it doesn't mean that, as has happened in the United States for the last, well, actually, in some respects, 20 years, more so under Trump than anyone else, tax cuts have been regarded as the way forward. The trickle-down theory was that even if the rich ended up with most of the money, they would spend it, and it would trickle down to the people at the bottom. Well, pretty much everybody in economics from Ecos 101 knows about the marginal propensity to save and the marginal propensity to spend. And the rich don't spend everything, they save more. In fact, the top 10% of America accounts for pretty much 100% of all the savings that America does. The bottom 50% of America is a net dissaver. So it doesn't work like that. And it just plays well to a certain group, generally speaking, a group that supports you financially And they've been able to sell this more broadly. It's and I'm not an unqualified fan of Thomas Piketty, not in the slightest, but the great French economist, and he really is a great French economist who's asking probably the hardest question in economics today, which is all about inequality, has broadly speaking got it right. And I suspect that inequality will be one of those reasons why, when historians come to look at this age, they will say, well, it was the gross inequality, among other things, that ultimately undermined the West.
Well, heading back to that, the West and how central bankers have behaved. When after 2008, we know, to save the US economy and in turn the world, QE was introduced as an experiment. Going back to global stock markets, are they now just addicted to this era of cheap money? And like, is there any getting out of this addiction? I'm just looking at now at global stock markets, even in this period of COVID, they've rebounded quite handsomely, even though economic outlook is as muddy as it is now.
Let me qualify you only slightly by saying Western stock markets. There are essentially multiple, but two broad, almost capital bubbles in the world at the moment. And I don't mean it bubble in the sense of a bubble in a stock market, but just sort of almost ecosystems, financial ecosystems. And the Western one, which is the one that we in South Africa are essentially part of. Although note, for instance, that our largest market cap company, which is Naspers, is actually part of the Eastern ecosystem, financial ecosystem. And that, in a way, is a very telling example. I think that you're absolutely right. I think that the Western stock markets are living on hope and liquidity at the moment. And if there is any material and serious disappointment, for instance, even a hint of a second wave in this pandemic, I think markets are going to have a tough time. Of course, on the other side, there is a race to find a vaccine or indeed, at a lesser level, the therapeutics that can treat COVID-19. And that could assist, and almost certainly will assist, the building of confidence. But this is going to be the essential battle that plays out for the balance of the year, the rest of the year. The hope on the other side, which must be manifested in terms of things like good news on the vaccine front, and the fear on the other side, which would definitely come about if there was any evidence of a second wave, or any evidence even of the fact that the relaxation from the lockdowns is actually going to start the whole process up again, or perhaps on a more limited form, but nevertheless, there's going to be a rebound in the infection rate, the so-called R0. And that's the big challenge for the balance of the year. I think also what we are going to see, and this gets us into the question of what is going to be the shape of the recovery. I think broadly speaking in the West, it's not going to be V-shaped. It may be in China, at least on the production side. But even in China, on the consumption side, it's going to need to be supported by government. Their rebound will be more powerful on the consumption side than it will be in the West. The real issue ultimately in the West is how can we get both production and then consumption back to something like it was before? And I think we're going to find out that it's much more complicated than we realize. And part of that is because, take the United States, 85% of its GDP is service-oriented. I was most struck by the difference in narrative that came out of China versus the US when we were talking about return to work. In China, return to work was, we need to get people back into the factories. In the United States, return to work was, we need to get people back into the tattoo parlors and hairdressers.
True. That's quite a difference, right? Yeah.
Very different. And there's a difficulty difference as well on that. China's story is first and foremost about supply of product and a good, and the United States is first and foremost about the supply of service.
Very different. Yeah. Now, so we've gone into the frailties of the West. What works for you about the Chinese system of governance and centralized economic management in this period as we over the next decade, or doesn't work really? What's your
Please don't think I'm here as a sort of representative of the Chinese government. I'm in a way, what I try and do is look at history and I look at the philosophy. And what I understand is that Chinese philosophy is built upon the needs of the collective, which is why an import from the West in the form of Marxism was able to gain some ground in China, because the two stories broadly matched, or at least had sufficient overlap, because communism was indeed something that spoke to the much older and much deeper Chinese philosophy of the needs of the community. In the West, it's about, first and foremost, the individual. Liberal democracy, the liberal word, is all about the rights of the individual. And indeed, you're seeing this whole story play out in the United States at the moment. What I think recent years have shown, and we can move into the almost neutral area of climate change, is that the needs of the community are important. And solving these problems that are arising from the likes of climate change, it's very difficult for the individual acting on his or her own to play that bigger part. The collective must actually come up with solutions. And I think what's happening now, and this now migrates over to the issue of what's happening in the economy, is that we're now seeing an age where collective solutions are going to be much more in demand. We can't, for instance, deal with a computer virus individually. We need to have some sort of collective solution. We can't deal with the locust plague that's threatening the whole of Eastern Africa at the moment individually. We need to have a collective solution. And I think what we're now realizing is that liberal democracy, if taken to an extreme, to the point where it just becomes a cult of an individual, and where, broadly speaking, individuals are looked to come up with a solution, doesn't work particularly well, especially in this age. And that's what we're now facing, which is why I make this distinction between the East and the West. I think that the age of collective solutions to the problems of the world, and we can think of pollution, climate control, and all the other things that throw pandemics, suggests that collective solutions are more suited to dealing with those challenges, which is something that China's much better at coming up with. Now, for instance, look at the whole issue of how tracking and tracing is going on. In the United States, there's a massive pushback on the basis of using my phone to track and trace me is a gross violation of my individual liberties. In China, the response was exactly the opposite. Please use my phone, because collectively, we all need to come to a solution. So please use my phone. I'll give you my individual data. You create that big data picture. And big data is an interesting story in itself. And as a result of that, we've seen that China was able to close down the spread of the pandemic far more effectively, far more quickly, far more decisively, because it did things which in the West, particularly in the United States, would have been seen as a gross violation of individual liberty. When you, even before all of this, as a Chinese consumer, went into any one of 40,000 restaurants in China, as you walked in, you smiled at the camera, because the camera then recorded your face using facial recognition, was then able to access your financial account. And if you had your burger and chips, it immediately deducted the cost of the burger and chips against your wallet that was in your cell phone. And you then walked out and smiled at the camera. And apparently there was even a way of giving tips related to this. And the camera recognized it. Now that in the United States, again, is seen as a gross violation of individual rights by many people, particularly, and I don't want to overly politicize what I'm saying here, but in the areas that Trump is strongest.
I mean, this rise of China and emerging Asia, the neighboring countries in that region, over the past 40 years, it has been quite remarkable. And it has destabilized traditional powers over the past 100 years and so on, and supported Africa's growth, right, in terms of raw material demand. How much longer realistically can it continue? It must at some point reach its limit at some other point, or do they have another 60 years to go? And when does China become bigger than US and almost plateau, as it were, in terms of growth rate?
Look, I think China will become bigger than the United States economically. It already is in a purchasing power parity terms, but that's just a eco-policy wonk term. The reality is that in simple dollars or simple renminbi, in the next 5 years, China will overtake the United States in economic size. However, China is not without its own medium-term problems, of which, and I've mentioned it before, demographics is probably the most important. Because of the one-child policy, China itself faces, come 2028, 2030, some serious demographic issues. It won't have enough young people, which is where their grand strategy of One Belt, One Road comes in. Because the One Belt, One Road vision encompasses a region, Africa, Asia, that has the best demographics and the best productivity growth prospects for the next 50 years. In other words, if your own demographics fail you, buy someone else's. And what you're going to see is that China Inc. will spread its umbrella over this region, so much so that its own growth as companies, which can't be generated at the pace previously that it was in China, will now be supplemented by growth that's coming from outside of China. So I think that the One Belt, One Road vision is a very clever way and almost disguised way for China to overcome or at least mitigate some of its own very, very serious demographic challenges that it will be facing in the next 10 years. Of course, that's where Africa comes in.
Yeah. I was about to ask about that, but with our demographic advantage of the rest of the world, is Africa well placed in these shifting times?
Yes, and in the next conversation we have, and this is the sort of a hint, we'll talk about what I call the rise of the Indian Ocean Basin, because the Indian Ocean Basin around it has the best demographics. And although in South Africa sometimes we choose not to be part of that basin, in fact, I'm convinced that many people in Durban think that the ocean outside is the Atlantic Ocean. In their cases, at least that's their orientation. The reality is that the Indian Ocean Basin was the most vibrant trading basin on the planet before 1500. The Atlantic really wasn't there as a basin, and the Pacific was barely crossed. The Indian Ocean was crisscrossed left, right, and center. How do you think Islam managed to cover the entire region even before the arrival of the Portuguese? So I think that we will see a restoration of the vibrancy of the Indian Ocean Basin over the next 20 years. And in South Africa, and I'm using almost a mission impossible phrase, if we choose to accept, we can be part of that. We have to break our fascination with an Atlantic view and start to think about an Indian Ocean view.
Final question before I let you go. Thanks so much for this. Has been an excellent interview. As an investor, as someone sitting out there wondering what to do over the next the next decade or so, on the basis of the shifting sands, just what do you do? What advice would you give someone, overly, just a broad strokes advice on what to look out for over the next decade as history is fast forwarded?
Well, in the first instance, preserve capital. You can't play in 5 years' time if you haven't got anything to play with. So the first priority has to be to preserve capital. Now, there are a number of ways, and that doesn't mean you just have to put everything in cash or possibly even add, though I would advise as a private investor you do this, add some gold to your portfolio. Whether you go with shares or the physical, both are going to be reasonably good in terms of preserving capital. But you need to find ways of playing the new through the old. Now, Naspers is a classic example. It's been the best example probably in the world. I mean, not many can rival what Naspers has done. I mean, Tencent is the second largest private company in China, and Naspers has a 31% stake in it. You've got to do a Naspers. We've got to find the next Naspers. But we have to hitch ourselves to the rising star, and to some extent start underweighting the falling ones. Now, the obvious falling ones there are probably going to be found in Europe, if they are European in terms of their end demand. If it's Nestle or Unilever or a number of other European companies that are massively shifting their focus to Asia, they in the consumer space are doing what Naspers has done. So my advice for the next 10 years is first find a Naspers, and within 5 years, you're probably going to be able to go more directly and actually buy Tencent itself. You don't necessarily have to buy the Tencent of the future today, although I've got one which I am absolutely fascinated by, and it 20% owned by Tencent, which is called Meitian Dianping. Please don't go out and buy that on the basis of my comment, but it's an incredible company which I think has a vision of the future which is breathtaking. And they're basically going to become Asia's Amazon for services, not for goods, but services.
Okay.
So if you want your cat brushed at 3 o'clock on a Monday morning, you can find it. So it's a fascinating concept, and I think it's going to grow very well. But in 5 years, I would suggest that rather than drinking what I call the cappuccino, which is essentially a European milked coffee, you start going for the espresso and look to invest much more directly into Asia.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us. This was excellent, and we will do the story about South Africa and keeping this economy relevant for these changes, right? It's something we must focus on, and hope to do that with you in the next week, hopefully.
I'm sending something through to you now.
All right. That was Michael Power, Global Strategist at 91, formerly Investec. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.